Welcome to the Ford Hall Forum at Suffolk University, and welcome to the newly renovated Modern Theater. You are among the very first people to be in it. It's going to be unveiled a few hours from now, this evening. As such, please be as clean and well-behaved as you can muster this morning. I'm Jen Bernardi. I'm the Executive Director of the Ford Hall Forum, the nation's oldest continuously operating free public lecture series, and this is Election 2010 and Communities of Color. I wanted to say that we greatly appreciate our generous sponsors, including, among others, the Lowell Institute, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, and our partners at Suffolk University, which serves as the Ford Hall Forum's home base. We also thank our members, whose generosity makes this free public event possible. This event is being recorded and will be available as a webcast on the WGBH Forum Network. If you're sharing a comment or a question, we are going to ask you to go to that mic right there so that we can hear you, but also so that we can capture you on video. By speaking, you're giving the Ford Hall Forum permission to record you. If you will, take a minute to turn off your cell phones if you forgot. That would be great. And let me introduce our moderator for today's discussion, State Representative Linda Dorcena Forry. Elected to the Massachusetts House of Representatives in a special election in 2005, Forry is only the second Haitian American ever elected to Massachusetts office. She represents the Commonwealth's 12th Suffolk District, a diverse and vibrant cross-section that includes parts of Milton, Dorchester, Hyde Park, and Mattapan. Prior to her election, Forry worked for the State Representative Charlotte Golar-Ritchie, and then served on executive staff of the Chief of Housing and Director of the Department of Neighborhood Development for the City of Boston. She was later the chair of the Black and Latino Caucus and chairman of the Joint Committee on Community Development and Small Business. In addition, she sits on a list of boards as long as my arm. Please help me in welcoming Linda Dorcena Forry, State Representative.
Thank you, Jen. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to all of you. I want to thank the Ford Hall Forum at Suffolk University for convening this program, Election 2010 and Communities of Color. And what perfect timing, just 2 days after the election. We have an exciting panel with us today, and we look forward to having really a dialogue and a discussion amongst all of you who are here. I want to take a moment to introduce our panels. Dr. Paul Watanabe should be on his way shortly. But I wanted to start off with Maria. Hold on. Maria Idali Torres is the current director of the Gastón Institute for Latino Community Development and Public Policy at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. She obtained a PhD from the University of Connecticut and an MS in Public Health from the University of Massachusetts. Prior to her current position, Maria spent 17 years as a professor of public health at the UMass Amherst campus and another 15 years practicing health education in community and school settings. Torres's research and publications have focused on the promotion, protection, and maintenance of reproductive and health among Latinas and their families. Most recently, Maria has been working on Latino youth, health disparities, and the prevention of teenage pregnancy. She has been the recipient of numerous grants and awards for her work at the local, state, and national levels. Please welcome Maria Idali Torres. And next, I want to welcome and introduce to you Marvin Venay. Marvin has served as the director of the Massachusetts Black and Latino Legislative Caucus since early 2007. He is recognized as an influential leader and believes that today's politics is in need of a more radical approach to serve its true purpose. A native of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and a Boston University alum, Marvin has a wide range of experience from corporate to nonprofit work. He serves on 2 nonprofit boards and mentors several students and professionals across the country. He is an activist, a husband, a father of 2, and a minister. Please welcome Marvin Venay. And so as we get this forum started, Tuesday, we all know, was a memorable day here in Massachusetts. probably not the nation, but here in Massachusetts with the re-election of Governor Deval Patrick. It is the first time in our history that an African-American governor has been re-elected for a second term as governor. And so, we are really fortunate here. And so I look forward to really having this discussion. Even in this tough time, economic time, I think what we found was the affirmation for Governor Patrick's leadership on Tuesday in terms of people coming out in record numbers. And so to the panelists, as we open it up, I wanted the panelists to say a few words, but before that, I want to introduce to you and welcome Dr. Paul Watanabe, who is on our panel. He is the director of the Institute for Asian American Studies at University of Massachusetts, Boston. Dr. Watanabe is a professor in the Department of Political Science and also serves on the faculty of the PhD program in Public Policy and the Master's program in American Studies. His principal research and teaching interests are in the areas of American foreign policy, American political behavior, ethnic group politics, and Asian Americans. He is the author of Ethnic Groups, Congress, and American Foreign Policy, and a principal author of A Dream Deferred, Changing Demographics, New Opportunities, and Challenges for Boston. Paul regularly contributes analysis and commentary to national and local media outlets. Thank you, Dr. Paul Watanabe, for joining us.
Thank you, and sorry for being late. I'm bad at finding parking spaces.
It's okay. A little tough around here. Okay, wanted to just open up to allow you to say a few remarks on the election that took place, obviously, just 2 days ago, and really your views on what was the effect of the election 2010 on people of color in Massachusetts. So any one of you I could pick, or good, Maria?
Well, I think that for the Latino community, we can begin to sort of look at the broader context at the national level. Latinos contribute significantly to a few very tight races, and including the governorship of New York and in California, where Latinos make the difference in the person that was elected. What we saw in Massachusetts and what we saw with the participation of Latinos at the national level, I think that it is very similar in the sense that there were intensive outreach by the campaigns, particularly from the Democrats candidates, to the Latino community. For example, Governor Deval Patrick campaigned aggressively in the cities with the largest concentrations of Latinos in Massachusetts. He also assembled and brought into his campaign a large number of Latino organizers who participated for the first time in all aspects of the campaign, from fundraising to the media. And another aspect of his campaign is that for the first time, a gubernatorial candidate invests in ethnic media, including Spanish radio, TV, and community newspapers. And I think that that is both the fact that there was a significant investment in ethnic but Latino media, and also the fact that he assembled a team of Latino organizers and brought them into their campaign is historic. I think that, and that to some extent reflects also the visible participation of the Latinos at the national level. I think that we are moving from what it was, a closed door meetings with community activists, and then once the candidates became were elected forgotten about the agenda of the Latinos to a more visible and public discourse about the contribution of Latinos to the political process and in terms of increasing the numbers voting. Now, I think that at the national level in Massachusetts, people, most Latino voters voted for jobs and the economy, with the second major concern, immigration. And those two topics, I think that brought a lot of people out to vote in these midterm elections.
Very good.
Now, in terms of, one more thing I want to say, that in terms of the Latino elected officials, it looks like we will probably have lost one of the state representative, although there's still
There may be a recount.
a recount. Yeah, there is still a
It needs to be.
recount.
It's two votes.
It's two
like
votes.
two
Yeah,
votes.
it's two votes. Which this is just a reminder that each vote counts.
That's right. And that's Representative Geraldo Alicia.
Alicia
Yeah.
from Southbridge. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, Marvin?
I think that it has really transcended where we were some 10 or 15 years ago. Now we have a minority population who is engaged in this process, and they are ready to stand up and deliver on Election Day. Many times they are considered the apathetic voter who does not engage in the process. But I think we've seen a turn in that in this most recent election, particularly around the gubernatorial race, where it was already indicated that we have a large investment made by our current governor, who just won re-election. I might add that he is the first African-American to be re-elected governor in the United States of America. That is a huge accomplishment. Not only was he was the second after the first after Reconstruction, but to get re-elected really says a lot about where this minority vote really counts and how it should be considered substantial moving forward. In other races, you'll notice that there was a huge outpour of Hispanics, there was a huge outpour of African Americans, there was a huge outpour of Asians, and I think that what we are seeing is that these individuals have determined that they will demonstrate that they have a voice, that they understand politics, and that they understand that policy changes are shifted based upon who's in office. So you have to get the right candidate in office, and you have to drive that candidate until the finish line is complete. And we've seen that with this recent election.
Thank you, Marvin. Paul?
Well, when I first came here to Massachusetts in 1972, that was the state that Massachusetts was called the one and only, because it was the only state that went for George McGovern for the presidential election this year. So I want to begin, actually, I'm willing to talk about Massachusetts later on, but I wanted to say something about just generally what happened on Tuesday and the election. And I think the picture in general is not a very pretty one for people of color on what happened and race in 2010. I think there's been a lot of discussion that it did not seem that overtly issues of race were part of the discussion in this election. I think they were absolutely central to this race in 2010. And they were particularly central to the appeal and the message of the people who were the big winners on Tuesday, and that was the right, not just the right, but the far right. And what were some of those elements? And I think the Tea Party sort of captures that, but that's a shorthand, but I think it's not an inappropriate shorthand as well. This, in my view, and many people think I'm wrong, but I think the Tea Party phenomenon is an important one. It's a strong one, and I think that people of color is at their peril to not recognize what is that behind it. What is behind it? I think there are a variety of elements to it, but much of it is overt. There is, for much of it, not all of it, an overt racism behind it. I think behind much of it, and very overtly, is a nativism, an anti-immigrant impulse behind it. There is no question that it is overt and clear that there is anti-Islam, anti-Muslim Islamophobia very much behind it. And it was reflected time and time again, this is my point, in respectable conversations and ads in this election year. I'm like many of you after an election like this, after watching the going back and forth, the ads and so forth, you know, you want to take a shower the next day. As I've said, I want to take a pressure wash, you know, after this one. I thought, at least, again, we like to think we're making progress as a society. This was a significant setback, I thought. And indeed, what is the language of that ascendant right? The language of the ascendant right of the Tea Party is, in fact, one of revolution, and I think in some ways that's appropriate. Because if you listen to the language of the Tea Party, they're not talking about simply changing policies, changing faces, that somebody made a bad decision. If you listen to the language, it is that our nation has been, quote unquote, occupied. It's been occupied. It's been taken over by some sort of foreign forces, is the argument. And who are those occupiers? Well, a shorthand way of thinking about it, but they represent much larger groups. A shorthand way of thinking about it, one looks out at the landscape in 2010 or after 2008, and the President of the United States, the most powerful person in the world, is an African American. Until yesterday, the most powerful person in the United States Congress is a woman, Nancy Pelosi. If you look at that African-American president, makes 2 appointments to the Supreme Court. Both of those appointments are women, and one of them is a Latina woman. Those are the occupiers, if you will, or they reflect in some ways. And the language of occupation is this, that our country has been taken over by somebody. Who's the somebodies that have taken it over? Well, to me, the why behind it is at least in part the changing demographics of our country. This is coming at a time when we are on the verge of being a country where it is a majority of people of color within this country. I do not think that there is just anything that I think these phenomenon are linked. And furthermore, it's a period of time in which the foreign-born population is growing. The report last week, 12% of the American population is now foreign-born. And this contrasts, by the way, with a period of relative stability politically in our country, if you think about it in the 1970s and so forth, when in the 70s, you always had sort of one assumption. It was like the Massachusetts politics. At least the Congress was always going to be in the Democrats' hands while you made changes in terms of the executive branch. Well, I don't think it's no coincidence that in 1970, as an example, that was the lowest period in the history of the United States of America in terms of the size of the foreign-born population in the United States. Only 4% of the population of the United States was foreign-born in 1970. Now it's 12%, and even more important, 11% of the American population now are children of immigrants. So think about that. About 1 out of every 4 Americans is an immigrant or a child of immigrants. This is part of that dramatic transformation that I'm talking about. So what's the impact of this? We've talked about these elections as wave elections, wave after wave. I think they're likely to continue, and I think that it reflects this political instability that we're having of response and reaction in big ways. I also think that we're starting to see something in terms of our political parties that I think a lot of people are missing. If you look at least at the national level, the makeup of our political parties, they are increasingly becoming a Democratic Party whose a large portion of it, overwhelmingly, people of color are Democrats. Mm-hmm. And if you look at a Republican Party that is overwhelmingly made up of whites and very few of this new group of people of color, we're having political parties that, to some extent, are starting to sort themselves out along the lines of the general demography of the country as a whole. Finally, let me say something. Are there any lessons to learn from this experience and in this election? I think there are. One thing that I think is very important for people to recognize and people who are concerned about the issue of race and community of colors is this, that elections are important, and I believe they're important, but they're not everything. See, I think part of the problem was a lot of people thought, for example, and there was a lot of energy to elect, as an example, President Obama, and they thought the work was done. And in fact, they're already talking about saying the next big job is to maybe get Obama reelected. Those are important, But to me, the important thing to tell us about race in society is not the election of Obama, what was done to Obama after he got elected, and what was done to him and by people of color after he got elected. That tells me much more about what's going on within the country than whether we elect this person or that person. I mean, I had a big debate last night, I'm sorry, it's because I'm hoarse, with a professor at Northeastern University who says, no, Paul, you got to look at what happened to the independent vote for Obama and what it did in this election. And I said, I think that's all important. But if we focus, frankly, as political scientists, and I can analyze elections like crazy, I can do it, and I'm happy to do it. But if we just focus on elections and winning elections, we miss, I think, this larger dynamic that's taken place. So finally, here, and the final lesson is crisis. We are facing a crisis, and I understand we're facing a crisis. But crisis can be a time in which we turn to each other. And I think 9/11 was an opportunity to turn to each other. The financial crisis is a time to turn to each other. But I think for many people, those are simply covers. Those are opportunities to turn on each other, to use a national security framework to pursue another agenda, to use the economic crisis to pursue another agenda, to turn on each other, the weakest among us, rather than to join together those who are struggling together. It is a continuing crisis. And I'll end with one. Early on in this crisis, Deval Patrick called some people to his office to say, gee, you know, we're going to have to make some very big cuts. I need some advice on making decisions. And this was a big room. A lot of people were in his private office, and all kinds of people. And so people went around the room, and they started, and one person started and said, we've never felt so much economic distress. People worrying about their pensions. The stock market had just gone down in a very big way. People wondered about what their investments look like and so forth. And so you kind of got to the end, and these were all important impacts. But what struck me is that there were people in this room for which this was a crisis, but it was nothing new. The idea of being able to put food on the table, to be able to provide for their families, to provide health care, forget about their stock portfolios, forget about their pensions. They're talking about getting a job the next day and getting their kids off to school. That's not the continuing crisis, that's the continuing reality. And I think that one thing that I think is interesting is that the financial crisis became a crisis when it touched some of those folks, and it is, but why wasn't it a crisis when it was touching people every day, even during the good times? And those people are disproportionately people of color.
Thank you, Dr. Watanabe, and thank you, panel. But to piggyback on what Dr. Watanabe said, you are correct in terms of these were issues that regular folks deal with every day. Before the financial crisis hit, people were going into foreclosure, and yet there was not an alarm. And so to bring that into a new question, which I think is interlinked, is that with the newly elected officials or re-elected officials, how do you think they're going to address these critical issues, whether it's education, whether it's immigration, affordable housing, economic development, in the ways that are going to affect Asian American community, the Black community, and the Latino community?
So I think that I agree with Paul in terms of the role of elections in policy changes. And I do think that it will be up to the communities to continue their engagement with the policymakers. I think that if we do what has been done in terms of the Obama administration, which is people had these very high expectations that by elected Obama, their lives were going to be different, and then getting disappointed that the progress that they were seeking on, it was not going to happen as soon as they wanted to. And with disappointment, disengagement in the political process. And when I mean political process, it's the political process beyond the elections. That includes advocacy and getting the voices heard and influencing the day-to-day decisions about policies that affects people's lives. So to me, I think it's going to depend on the level of engagement of the voters with the elected officials that are working on their policy that affect their lives.
I think that what's going to happen is that you're going to see a shift in how politics was handled. With the recent election of more Republicans in the House, that's going to make an impact on the viewpoint. I do not believe that we are going to see a alarming amount of cuts that are going to take place in the economy, or particularly in Massachusetts, quite like it has been predicted. And as you saw in this gubernatorial race, there were a number of suggestions that we make some extensive cuts. But I believe in Massachusetts you will find a more working group in the House and in the Senate that will produce some good quality bills that will allow for us to restore the economy in this state and to really advance its movement. Particularly what you're going to find is there are going to be more activists involved. There will be more people out there knocking on the doors of legislators, pushing their agendas and trying to make sure that their voice is heard. And we will no longer sit back and just wait for a bill to be passed, particularly. In past times, you would just find that a bill would go through the House or go through the Senate, and it might be overlooked by the average constituent because they weren't aware of the process, or they just weren't necessarily privy to how you go about lobbying for a bill to get passed. But I think in this day and age, with the recent election and how things have changed, you will see an influx of voters going into the State House to actually push their agendas and make sure that their voices are heard. So it's going to be a shift, but I think this will be a positive shift. If we go onto the national front, we are going to see how, with the Republicans taking majority of the House, we are going to see a shift in tax cuts that will be, sometimes it could potentially be disheartening for most Americans. The Republicans are more fiscally conservative, and so they're going to say that we're going to balance the budget. And I think that we will see some changes in the budget being balanced, but I do notice that there will be some overhauling of some bills, in particular the health care bill they're looking to overhaul. They made that quite clear. And I'm concerned with where that leaves the average citizen who can't afford the health care current rate that it is right now. So I'm concerned on how that's going to be a change. And then I also think about, is this going to make a difference for President Obama? I actually think he's probably in a greater position right now as it relates to the House being in the Republicans' hands and the Senate being in the Democrats' hand, because now we can get some work accomplished. Now they feel like there's an even playing field, and now we can actually have some conversations. If we notice in our previous cycle, there were Democrats who did not agree with his bills, who were completely on the opposite side of him, and it has to take some tuggling to get that accomplished, where there were some Republicans who were willing to compromise and willing to find a sort of solution to the matter. I think what we're going to see right now is a change that we've seen in past cycles, where we're going to see a balance that is going to make up something great and create some real partnerships as we move forward. We will see a difference in 2 years when we go to seek the presidency once again.
Thank you, Marvin. Paul?
Well, this is a hard question. Maybe first at the national level, I do think that there are some opportunities and some advice about dealing with all of these issues that you raise, Linda. I think that there should be and should have been, under the Obama administration and the Democratic Congress, a bigger push on jobs and infrastructure spending for jobs. This is one area of government spending that people tend to actually like across the political spectrum, frankly. And I think there should be and should have been a bigger focus on jobs. That was an opportunity that I think was missed, and I think it cost them. It's an opportunity that we'll see whether they take out. There was also another opportunity missed as well. This morning, I heard someone from the Tea Party, one of the national figures, say that in terms of dealing with these financial issues, he says, today's spending is tomorrow's deficit. And so in some ways, they want to attack the spending. Very reasonable. But one should also understand that yesterday's tax cuts are today's deficit, too. And this is something, once again, that I don't think that the Obama administration, a very big missed opportunity, the Obama administration and the Congress, why, for the life of me, and there's data to indicate that the public supports this, why the Congress and the Obama administration did not push hard to end the Bush-era tax cuts for people making over $250,000. There is agreement, broad agreement in the country that it is just unfair to extend those tax cuts to people making that of money in the face of the impact of extending those tax cuts on the deficit. So there are missed opportunities there. Let me just say something about the state here, and I know I was supposed to say something about Asian Americans nationally. Nationally, at least as I can tell in terms of the House, I think that we added 2 Asian Americans and we took away 2 Asian Americans. Maybe the most celebrated or best known Asian American who lost was the first Vietnamese American congressman in Louisiana, Mr. Gao, who in some ways courageously was one of the few Republicans to vote for the health care reform legislation, and he was defeated. On the other side, the first Bangladeshi American was elected to the United States Congress in Michigan. So at least for now, it looks like add 2, subtract 2. In the Massachusetts state legislature, on the House side, for the first time in the history of this Commonwealth, we have 2 Asian Americans now. I always used to go to these forumans and they talk about the Latino caucus and the Black caucus and the Asian caucus. Was a virtual caucus because there was nobody to caucus with. Now at least 2 people can get together, and interestingly, 1 Republican and 1 Democrat, and then part of Sonia Chang Diaz could also caucus as well, I suppose. But so that's a transformation. And finally, just to add to Idali's point, and I'm happy to talk about Patrick too, and I think he did the most amazing campaign that I think I've seen in my 30-something years experience here in Boston. But I think Idali's point is an excellent one, which is it's important to look to political leadership at the top levels, but I think part of the hard struggle is to look at it in other places and at other levels. And by the way, there's a lesson here from the Tea Party. The Tea Party is going to attempt to influence American society not by simply electing Engel and O'Donnell and Miller and so forth, of which they had mixed luck. They're going to try to influence American politics by going to school committee meetings, by going to town council meetings. They're going to attempt to try to, what happened in Phoenix and SB 1070, that's the strategy. That's the strategy. And where we've got to be, or I should say, well, I'm a person of color. Okay, so we've got to be active at those particular levels. And we've got to look for leadership in some of the strangest places. We debate and talk about immigration reform and the immigration agenda in the country. You know what? The leadership on those issues has not been, in my view, in the last 6 months, provided by Washington. It hasn't been provided by governors. It hasn't been provided by the president. It hasn't been provided by Congress. It's provided by high school and college kids who are undocumented, who are the people who are pushing the immigration reform agenda more than anybody. Those people at those other levels should be ashamed of themselves. They should both be ashamed of themselves and look at those kids as the true leaders on immigration reform within this country.
Thank you, Paul. Now what we're going to do, we're going to open it up for questions, Q&A, and really to try to have a discussion. So does anyone have any questions they would like to ask? Ms. Sarah Ann Shaw. Oh, to the mic.
I'd like to know, given the status of the Tea Party and the Republican sweep, how do you think it's going to be possible to really engage large numbers of people of color who are, many of them, unemployed or working low-level jobs, et cetera? How is it going to be possible to engage them, be they African American, Asian, Latino, to understand the implications of this recent election and what needs to be done in terms of pushing locally, school committees, city hall, state houses, and federally elected people?
I'll take a stab at it.
Thank you.
We have to go back to grassroots. We have to go back to the ground, and we have to go and knock on doors and inform the voter of what is going on in the community. We have to go to our local meetings that are taking place throughout the Commonwealth and the various communities, and we have to address the issues that are on hand. Dr. Paul noted that this is what the Tea Party strategy is going to be, and frankly, I think that we should all have that strategy of trying to influence the average constituent. I think what you're going to find is that there are certain meetings that take place for those who are depressed, those who are emotionally scarred, and those are meetings where we should be at as well, because these are individuals who are starting to deteriorate due to the fact that they have not had a job, that they don't have health care, or that their children are, that they don't have the financial means to address their children's needs. And so I think that we are losing losing the ground if we do not go into some of these more untraditional places to look for the voter and explain to them what the process is. I also wanted to note that the recent elections were influenced heavily by outside contributors. A particular group by the name of American Futures Fund funded with $75 million to invest in the elections of destroying some of the opposing candidates. This particular group was a Republican-based group. And the interesting thing that we find is that the Supreme Court passed a law where you do not have to inform the IRS of who your donors are. So large corporations were flooding the gates with monies to make sure that there was an influence in the races across the country to knock out those individuals who you did not see fit to be in office. So when Dr. Paul talks about the Tea Party used a different strategy. They found a way to use their money from groups that were far off from the candidate of your choice, and they would totally go into these communities and create a characterization of the opposing candidate in a commercial. We've seen a number of these commercials that were considered negative ads, and in those ads we witnessed that there were some candidates who were completely annihilated, if you will, as it related to their character, as it related to their family life, as it related to their policy changes, in a number of ways. And these are the sort of tools and mechanisms that were put in place to make sure that we heard the voice of the opposing party. We have to do some of those similar tactics as it relates to informing voters because they pay attention to the TV screen. So if we're going to make a difference, we have to make a difference by flooding the airwaves sometimes with commercials related to this information so that we can get out the data necessary to make sure that every voter knows that moving forward, you have to be involved very early and your voice has to be heard, and you have to go to your legislators and say, this is the issues and this is how I need some assistance. But otherwise, we are going to sit back and be in this position once again if we don't go down to the very bottom and meet these people where they are. We might even have to go into the classrooms and meet with some of the students and meet with their families at parent-teacher meetings as well.
Thank you, Marvin.
Well,
Maria?
I want to reinforce 2 points that you make. 3 actually. One is I do agree that grassroots organizing, it's the key. And in both when Governor Patrick ran the first time and also Obama, they created a very good infrastructure of grassroots organizing. And then once they got elected, that infrastructure for a period of time was completely depleted. And they have to begin again. And I think that that's what happens. People get organized during elections, and then they go home and forget about the rest of the policy-making process. So I agree that grassroots is important. And also agree that we need to expose the contradictions of the Tea Party, because in one hand, the Tea Party is saying that this country is being invaded by immigrants, and in the other hand, they are silenced when this country is being invaded by corporate dollars. And the third point to support your comments is that I do believe that we need to use the ethnic media as a tool to educate the regular voter on the very important issues that affect their life, and often we do not use. I mean, I think that there are tools in the community that are not used as they should be to educate the voters about the issues and about the different strategies and the contradictions, for example, that exist in some of these more conservative right-wing groups.
I agree with my colleagues that the idea of building alliances and coalitions is an important response to Sarah's question. But there's a very important preliminary step, and that is there's got to be a basis for it, and there has to be some understanding. And I don't think we've been good at establishing that understanding. In some ways, particularly during difficult times, we get torn apart, even people who have naturally should be allied with each other. And so what are some of those understandings? I talked at a forum largely of an African-American audience the other day, and one woman sort of rose up. She said, I'm a Rwandan immigrant. She says, and Professor Watanabe, you know, everything you said, I feel. You know, I feel as being a black woman. I feel as being an immigrant, that I'm under duress. I'm being looked at. I'm being questioned, and so forth. And she says, what do I do? And I said, well, one thing, look around this room. There were people in that room who were in their 80s and their 70s who had gone through the struggles within the United States. They know what those looks are. Those are people who know what it has been like to live under essentially an apartheid regime within the South. They understand about that. And I said part of that is to understand that there are resources and experience that you're not alone. You're not alone now, and you're not alone historically in terms of what you are facing. And we've got to make those particular connections. I talked with Salvador Reza, one of the leaders. He's been arrested like every week by Sheriff Arapeo in Phoenix. But he gets arrested just to piss off the community. They respond, he lets them out. And he says the secret is to create a movement that links Selma, that goes from Selma to Phoenix. And how do you do that? Well, the way you do that, and I got it, again, the student immigration movement, who are the students who are pushing for the DREAM Act. These are 17, 18-year-old kids, largely Latino kids. Where do they search for inspiration? They take a bus ride to Little Rock, Arkansas. Why? Because they studied their history and said, where was the first time some students wanted to try to get some justice within the United States? And they went to Little Rock because we had 9 kids there for the first time who decided that they are going to desegregate a public school. And there were 2 of these people who are still alive and met with these kids. That's how we draw these particular connections, historically and within groups. And finally, let me say, I don't know if any of you are reading Isabel Wilkerson's book, The Warmth of Other Suns, which talks about the great migration of African Americans from the South to the North. And I'm reading this particular book now, and I sometimes thought, where am I going to get inspiration for bringing together all these groups, immigrants, African Americans, and so forth? Well, she gave me a clue. And she says early on in the book, and I'm only paraphrasing, she says, what I'm talking about in this book, the movement of African American peoples north and west, is the same thing that brought people seeking religious liberty across the ocean in 1620 to Plymouth. It's the same thing that brought people from Ireland when the ground was not producing potatoes. It's the same thing that brings Chinese and others when the ground, when the fields are fallow. It's the same thing that brings Mexicans when they can't find opportunity. It's the same thing that led Jews who were suffering under Nazism. It's the same thing that made Oklahomans move when the ground was turning to dust. It's the same thing, and the same thing is this. When people are suffering and facing oppression, economic and otherwise, they get up and move to a better place. This is fundamental. It's what links the black experience. It's what links those immigrants coming to the United States. And we should understand that we're linked together in those experiences, that we shouldn't be torn apart. So at least understanding, I think, is the first step.
Very good. Thank you, Paul. Do we have another question? Well, I do want to just piggyback on some of the things that were mentioned. I do agree in terms of the grassroots organizing is critical in bringing the issues to the people. Being a member of the legislature, that's what we try to work on, is how do you get more people involved in coming out to vote? And I think one of the piece, we talked about the negative ad and the money spent. I do think that the commercials and the negative ads did actually boost turnout because folks realize that, wait a minute, we may lose the corner office, and that we need to come out in record numbers to show the support. And in my district in particular, there was no enthusiasm gap. People came out in record numbers in communities of color in Mattapan, in Hyde Park, in Milton, and in Dorchester to really show support for the governor and really the team in terms of the vision. So, we have a lot of work to do, and I think we've touched on all of the issues, that are before us. We mentioned President Obama in terms of inheriting a dysfunctional, debt-ridden government over the last 8 years, and he's been in it for about 22 months, and we've expected him to do miracles, right? But he was able to do some things. However, it's working together with a coalition, Democrats and Republicans, working together and really moving in one direction is the way we're going to change the way we do things here in this country, and in particular in Massachusetts. So I want to open it up for questions. Do you have any more questions? No? But go ahead, Paul.
I just wanted to make a point that the other point that I think we should add is the wave of the internet. I think the internet is a tool that has been underutilized as we particularly consider the grassroots perspective. Yes, it's about knocking doors. Yes, it's about attending community meetings, and yes, it's about making sure that your neighbor understands. But it's also about touching base with those youth. Youth are more inclined to witness voter information online. If you put it on Facebook, if you put it on Twitter, if you put it on, any of the constant contacts, and you send out a mass distribution list, you will inform that population because they are our next leadership. And if we're not engaging them at ages 13 and ages 14, and even sometimes before that, then we can anticipate that they will be engaged when they're 18 and really be interested in voting. You have to teach them from the very beginning. And because, I grew up in Pittsburgh, and we had civics in our school system. So you understood from the very beginning what it was to have a president of the United States, to have a city council, to have a local assemblyman. You understood those processes. And I don't believe in our schools right now that we've made enough investments in civics to articulate the message for why voter participation is of value. So I think that as we are trying to make sure that we go out and talk to our constituents in the community, and our leadership is driving. As you just noted, Representative Forry said that in her district, this is what the results were. But I can guarantee you that they were the results because of her leadership. Going out, knocking on doors, and promoting this agenda, and making sure that the constituent understood that if you don't vote, here what the potential of the results are going to be. Most constituents will follow their leadership, and if your leadership is strong, you will see an outpour of voters coming out on election day. But if your leadership is influx and your leadership is weak and not consistent, then you will see a low turnout, or you'll see a high turnout to overturn that leadership that's in office.
Very good. So that leads us into one more question, and then we will wrap up, is the potential of new leadership. And what do you see of the future of potential candidates for office in our state and from communities of color?
Well, actually, I look around because there was no new state rep or senator elected for the first time coming from the Latino community. And as we mentioned before, and one of the current state representatives may not come back in January because there is now a recount underway, and it may be that he lost the election by 1 or 2 votes. And I think that for the Latino community, this is crucial. The leadership development and equipping the younger generation to assume positions of leadership, not only in elected positions, but also in other policymaking positions and in other leadership roles that are critical in order to improve the conditions of the Latino community. So we do have a lot of work to do, and there are organizations such as OISTE who are that are doing political training in many communities. But I think that the task is really overwhelming, and one organization only can do so much to address the level of need. And so for the Latino community, I think that an investment needs to be done on leadership development as well as more voter education.
Thank you, Maria. And just to say, we do have my colleagues, Representative Jeffrey Sanchez from Boston, Representative Cheryl Coakley Rivera, Springfield, and a new representative from Lawrence who took over Willie Lantigua's seat, and also Senator Chang Diaz, who counts for Latina and Asian, right, serving in our legislature. I also, in terms of Paul, I know we've had notable turnouts in terms of the record number for the governor, but as you mentioned, you know, we have a notable piece where we have the first Asian American representative, and that's Taki Chan from Quincy. And I wanted you to touch base a little bit in terms of the turnout there and really supporting the Asian community and making sure that we have a voice in the represented at the State House.
Well, again, I think it's truly historic that we actually have two in this election. Donald Wong from Saugus also was elected, I believe. I know he ran, and I just assumed, I haven't even had a chance to check a state rep total, but I had just assumed that he was going to win, and I think he did. Anybody know? He did? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So it's truly historic, and I think it's very important. There's no question about it. And you know, in basketball, they say, you know, never up, never in. Unless you can't score unless you shoot the ball. And I think that a lot of Asian Americans are attempting to shoot the ball. They're attempting to run. I thought it was. There's no question that Sam Yoon, for example, taking on the mayor, and he lost big time. But I think it had an effect on young people who were saying, my God, I've never seen somebody with the name of Sam Yoon running for mayor and taking on the most entrenched politician in Massachusetts. And so I think that has an effect on people like that. Now, by the way, they're going to be held to a real standard, I will say, too, by our own communities. I mean, I think Taki Chan, who I know and I admire, is going to have to get educated on some of the stances that he took within that campaign, because I disagree with him on some of them. And Donald Wong is going to need even a bigger education, I think. I just hope he gets some of that Kowloon money. His family owns a Kowloon restaurant. They could settle the state debt alone, I think. If they just gave the state a loan 10 cents out of every meal that's served there, we could solve the state's debt crisis. But yeah, we are seeing some of this leadership emerging. But you know, I am not one of those who argues the only important thing is having seats at the table. It is important having seats at the table. But I think agenda and what you stand for is very important as well. And there's some new Asian seats at the table nationally. We have a Democratic governor, for example, in South Carolina, a Republican governor who's Indian American, whose agenda, at least I can say this now. See, when I'm on television, I can't say these things, but I can say this, that I think her agenda is terrible, frankly. And I think Bobby Jindal's, who is the biggest star Asian American in the country right now, I think has a bad agenda, at least in terms of the issues that are important to me. So seats at the table are important, but that's not enough.
Yeah, and I think the same thing happened for Latinos. There is a new Latina governor in New Mexico, Republican, whose agenda also doesn't serve well the Latino community, in my opinion, as well as the other one is Sandoval in Nevada. And of course, you know, Rubio won by more than 50% of the vote with Latino. And the interesting thing about the new elected Latinos is that they were for the most part, Republicans. So this is Rubio. There's another state rep in Florida that is Latino and Republican, and the governor of Arizona, and then the governor of Nevada.
Thank you, Maria.
And it's very interesting when you were talking, Paul, about the fact that the division between the parties, in which the Republican looks much less diverse than the Democratic Party, and yet some of the Latinos who are being elected and supported by the Republicans. So I think that this is something also that we have to pay attention and trying to understand better what is happening, that there are more Latinos, Republicans being elected than Democrats nationwide.
Thank you, Maria. Marvin?
I just want to leave on this point in saying I agree with Dr. Watanabe's point about having seats at the table. Moving it further is having the right people at the table. I think that part of the issue is that we are finding that there are candidates who are just willing to run but not secure on the issues. We have to return back to the point where we're looking for candidates who actually understand the challenges of the community, have lived through some of the challenges, that can articulate that message smoothly. There are organizations that are thinking about strategically how we can implant individuals in seats in certain locations across this Commonwealth. One particular organization that is coming to mind that is a fairly new organization called Think Politics. And the strategy is to find black leadership that needs to be cultivated and educated on the issues and empower them to go out and seek seats across the Commonwealth. If we're going to make a change and impact, we have to think not just in our local arenas, but we have to think about the broader scale of the entire state. We have to find individuals in each community who understands the issues and start to push them to be elected. No longer can we sit back and just allow the average person to continuously be reelected. There has to be a change in power if you're going to see a change in policy. And so if you're not willing to make the strategic investment as you go looking for an alignment of new candidates, then you're going to continuously receive the same results. And so I'm anticipating as we move forward that there will be a number of organizations like Think Politics that is thinking about this thing from a broader scale and figuring out who we can put in office in Worcester, who we can put in office in Springfield, who we can put in office in New Bedford, who we can put in office out in Walpole. These are communities that have not seen, some of them have not seen candidates of color, but there are candidates of color who live there. And so if you're not going out and looking for them, then you won't find them, and they will not be inclined to run if there's no support behind them. So we have to go out and make sure that we are finding the right candidate and not just taking the same old candidate and just living by the rules that have been going on. But if you don't take a radical shift and you don't expect change, you will never see the change that we're looking for in America, and we'll stay the same that we've been, and we will never see true democracy.
Thank you, Marvin. And that is where we come and we talk about, just to wrap it up, in terms of local engagement. So how is it that we're going to plug people into the community meetings that are taking place every month, like we talked about, learning about the process. In Boston, it's different, right? We have an appointed school committee. But in all these other communities, 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts, we have an opportunity to put candidates of color forward, whether it's school committee and these different committees that are out there, planning committee, so many different things, really to have a voice and to diversify, the agenda that is being put forth in these neighborhoods and these cities and towns. So I want to take this time to thank the Ford Hall Forum at Suffolk University and for discussion, this lively discussion about elections 2010 in communities of color. And I thank all of you for coming out this morning. Although it was really early, you were here. So thank you so much and have a good day.
Thanks so much to our speakers and our moderator. Please feel free to continue the discussion. Go on out into the lobby and finish up that food and coffee. And if you're interested in membership, there's plenty of information at the table. Thanks.